Hey, welcome back. I'm Ibnul J. Farabi, and this is Empire Builders, the rise and fall of civilizations. You know, living in New York, you get used to seeing history written in stone and steel. But sometimes, the most profound histories are the ones written in the dust, carried on the wind across a different kind of landscape. Today, I want to take you to the sweeping savannas and arid plains of West Africa in the 19th century, to an empire born in a fiery revolution, built on faith and scholarship, and sustained by an institution so brutal it would become its defining and ultimately damning legacy. This is the story of the Sokoto Caliphate, Africa's last great slave empire. Picture this. It's around 1804 in what is now northern Nigeria. The region is a patchwork of Hausa city-states, each with its own ruler. But to a charismatic, deeply devout Muslim scholar named Usman Fodio, these states are corrupt. They've mixed Islamic practice with older traditions, they're unjust in their rule, and in his eyes, they are failing the people. Fodio, a man more inclined to prayer and poetry than war, finds himself declared the leader of a movement. He calls it a jihad, a struggle. But this isn't a jihad against outsiders. It's an internal revolution. He and his followers, the Fulani, rise up against the Hausa kings. And they win. It's astonishing. From this spiritual and military uprising, a new empire is forged, the Sokoto Caliphate. It becomes the largest single state in Africa in the 19th century, a beacon of Islamic learning, law, and administration. Sokoto City, its capital, hums with the energy of scribes, judges, and students. Fodio and his family, especially his son Muhammad Bello and his daughter Nana Asmiu, who was a phenomenal poet and educator in her own right, create a state deeply invested in knowledge. This was, in many ways, a golden age for the region. But here's the complex, uncomfortable heart of the matter. This empire's economic engine, the foundation of its agricultural wealth and its social structure, was slavery. And we have to talk about it plainly. The Sokoto Caliphate was built on a system of large-scale plantation slavery that, in its scope and systematization, rivals the more familiar images we have of the American South. After the wars of conquest ended, the state needed a continuous labor force to work the vast fields of cotton, indigo, and grain that fed its cities and funded its scholarship. So, they turned to annual military campaigns, called gain or raids. These weren't random skirmishes. They were state-sponsored, organized expeditions into non-Muslim territories to the south. Villages would be surrounded, people captured, and marched back in coffles, long lines of men, women, and children bound together, to be sold in markets across the caliphate. The scale is hard to overstate. Historians like Paul Lovejoy estimate that by the mid-19th century, over half the population within the caliphate might have been enslaved or of slave descent. This wasn't a side business, it was the core of the economy. And this is where the story intersects painfully with the wider world. Because while the Atlantic slave trade was being abolished, the Sokoto Caliphate was becoming the single largest supplier of captives for a different, ancient system, the Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean slave trades. Caravans now headed north across the desert, not just with gold and ivory, but with human beings. Many of these enslaved people ended up in the Middle East, in places like the Ottoman Empire. So, as one door of suffering was slowly closing, another was flung wide open, powered by the internal dynamics of this powerful new African empire. The Caliphate's leaders saw this not as some moral contradiction, but as a religious and economic imperative. Enslaving non-Muslims was permissible under their interpretation of Islamic law, and the revenue was essential. It created a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. The state needed slaves to sustain its economy, so it needed to constantly expand its raids, which in turn required more administration and military, which then needed more revenue from slave-produced goods. It was a machine. Now, let's fast forward to the late 1800s. The world is changing. European powers are carving up Africa at the Berlin Conference. The British have established themselves on the coast of what will become Nigeria, and they are slowly, inexorably, pushing inland. They are motivated by commerce, by the so-called civilizing mission, and by a growing imperial rivalry with France and Germany. And they have a specific policy, the abolition of the slave trade. For the British, Confronting the Sokoto Caliphate isn't just about territory. It's a moral crusade against a slave society. The Caliphate, for its part, sees the British as infidel invaders, and more pragmatically, as a direct threat to their entire way of life. The final confrontation comes in 1903. A British force, led by Frederick Lugard, marches on Kano, the Caliphate's major commercial hub, and then on Sokoto itself. The battle is fierce but brief. The last caliph, Adahai Ruai, is defeated. He retreats east with a large following, in what many see as a symbolic hijra, or migration, mirroring the Prophet's flight from Mecca, an attempt to preserve the purity of the community in the face of an overwhelming, unbelieving force. He is killed in battle later that year. The empire, as a sovereign state, is finished. Sitting here, thinking about this story, I'm struck by a profound irony. The Sokoto Caliphate began as a revolution against what its founders saw as corruption and impiety. It sought to create a just, scholarly society based on pure Islamic principles. And in many ways, it succeeded, leaving a lasting cultural and religious legacy that defines northern Nigeria to this day. But to build that society, it embraced and industrialized an institution of utter brutality. It became the very thing it sought to replace, a system built on the exploitation of human beings for its economic survival. It's a stark reminder that empires, even those born of idealistic revolution, are rarely pure. They are human constructs, layered with contradiction. They can produce beautiful poetry and codified law with one hand, and unleash devastating violence with the other. The Caliphate's fall came not from internal moral reckoning with slavery, but from an external force that, for all its own imperial hypocrisy, wielded abolition as a weapon of conquest. So what are we left with? The Sokoto Caliphate forces us to hold two truths in our minds at once. It was a center of African learning, governance, and resistance to colonialism, whose intellectual traditions endure. And it was also one of history's most prolific slave societies, whose actions caused immense suffering and shaped the demographics of a continent. Its story is a powerful chapter in the narrative of 19th century Africa, not as a passive victim of the Atlantic system, but as a powerful, complex, and autonomous actor that created its own system of exploitation, right up until the moment the modern world crashed into its gates. It was, truly, the last great slave empire of Africa. Thank you for listening. If these stories of complex empires and the people who built them resonate with you, please share this episode with someone who'd appreciate it. And for more deep dives into history's forgotten corners, make sure you're subscribed to Empire Builders wherever you get your podcasts. This has been Ibnul J. Farabi for Light Knot Studios. Visit us at lightknotstudios.com. Until next time, take care.